Let me read to us a word from St. John's Gospel. We're going through some of the I am sayings in that fourth Gospel, and we come to chapter 15 this morning. We begin here. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. So remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. But if you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish. It will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We tried it a few years ago. I can tell you that it is a very labor-intensive task. For after we cleared a spot in the backyard one spring, we drove in stakes and we put up wire lines and we carefully planted some expensive vines. I mean, from a real nursery, not just Home Depot, okay? We nurtured them every day. We watered them. We spoke French to them so they would know we were sincere. We used all kinds of organic materials to try to encourage them to grow up in a healthy, Earth Day friendly kind of way. We did everything we could to make certain that ours were without a doubt the most loved vines in all of the neighborhood. But in the end, what we got out of our Herculean efforts were just a few tiny little grapes. Enough perhaps to make up one small communion cup. Not the chalice, those throwaway plastic cups. One thimbleful of somewhat sour juice, not white, not rosé, kind of a sickly fuchsia color. All in all, our great grape growing enterprise was such a costly and time-consuming flop, we never did it again. We had to cancel the contract with Welch's. But maybe we quit too soon. In ancient times, vineyards were far more demanding than our experience was because the land in Judea, much like our own Texas hill country, rolling hills, limestone formations. I mean, if you want to grow anything, you have to build a terrace with retaining walls along the hillside just to give you some sort of a flat surface to work with. And then you had to bring good soil up from the valley down below, from the Sorek, which meant putting it into a bag, tossing it over your shoulder, hauling it up yourself, sack by sack, little by little, trip after trip. Then you had to put some sort of a drainage system in to make sure your vines had enough water, but not too much water. You had to build a fence or plant a hedge or something, put around your plot of land to try to keep the red foxes out. All before you ever even brought in the shoots to plant. But even then, it took 4 or 5 years before any grapes were actually produced. And when they finally did come along, you had to be ready to build a little watchtower on your plot so you could stay out in the vineyard all during the harvest season and protect it. And God said he did all of that. Psalm 80, verse 8 tells us, God transplanted his people like a vine out of Egypt. He cleared the ground for them, he said, until they took root and they filled the land. But in the end, at least according to Isaiah 5, when God looked for good grapes, all he found were bad ones. Somehow, the people of Israel, who were supposed to be, in Jeremiah's words, a noble vine, in whom God delighted, the root which his right hand planted, those vines failed to produce any fruit worthy of the one who made them. Which is perhaps why when Jesus came along 700 years later, that doing that which Israel had never seemed to be able to do for itself, Jesus deliberately chose to use the same language in describing himself and his mission. John tells us here in one of 7 different places in the gospel, which use the same I am formula. We're going to talk about several of them during this month ahead. Jesus said to his disciples, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. You are the branches. I am. There was a particular poignancy in even using that formula. I wrote a few words about it in the bulletin today in the Weekly Word. To say I am was not simply to make a pronouncement or an observation about one's identity. It was to tie oneself to the sacred identity of God himself. You may recall when God spoke to Moses through that burning bush that this one depicts. And Moses in turn asked God what his name was. The Lord said simply, I am who I am. This is to say, God revealed he's not just the key to life, the key to breath. He's the source of all life, all being, all knowing, all existence, everything. I am. Martin Buber once said you could even translate that by the words, I will be what I will be. Or even, I really like this, I will be there. Wherever you are, wherever you wander, whenever you need me, I will be there. And Jesus told his followers here in John 15 that he is the true vine, the ampelos he aletene. That means the grapevine that is authentic, that is substantial, that is sincere, that is utterly genuine, both inside and out. And in a world in which truth seems to be a rather endangered species, even a missing commodity in some places, to find something genuinely authentic and unwaveringly true is increasingly rare, isn't it? It's not just in the world of politics that fake news seems to have taken root. There are all kinds of fake ideas, fake belief systems, false ideologies that are running rampant in the world, so much so that sometimes even the obvious isn't enough for some people. I read a few weeks ago of a man named Constantine Reliu. After 20 years working in Turkey, he returned to his native country of Romania at the age of 63. And when he got there, he found out that the Romanian government, at his wife's urging, had declared him to be deceased. He was accordingly subjected to 6 hours of testing and questioning at the border. They asked him topographical questions about his hometown. They measured the contours of his face, compared him to old passport photos. They took his fingerprints and checked those, and finally they released him. But when he got to his hometown, the officials there, nonetheless, denied his request to overturn his death certificate on the basis of it being too late. you are too late to tell us you're not dead. And so Constantine Relu is still officially dead. Because he's dead, he can't do anything. He can't get a job. He can't get a pension. He can't leave the country. He can't stay in the country. He's dead. Only he's not. That's crazy, isn't it? But we've negated the truth in other ways as well. We've pretty much been sold a bill of goods that we can do whatever we please and it won't matter, that there won't be any consequences for our actions. What we used to call sin was simply a misinformed misunderstanding. That fidelity and faithfulness are hopelessly old-fashioned. That incredible people like Barbara Bush are a throwback. I read of one college professor in California who called her publicly a racist who raised her son to be a warmonger. She tweeted she's happy that, quote, the witch is gone. Can you imagine? She also believes she can't be fired because she has tenure. And the culture of many colleges would seem to support that. We've been told there is no such thing as absolute truth anymore, except, of course, their absolute truth about there being no absolute truth. Whatever you think is right for you is all that matters. You know, that's exactly where ancient Israel failed to be God's vineyard. Because in the end, they forgot that to be God's people in this world, we have to stay connected to the true vine, who is Jesus himself. That means, first and foremost, we are never our own final authority in life. We're every one of us accountable to somebody else, to the one who made us, who revealed his truth to us in his word. We're accountable to God. How we live, what we say, how we act, all of it. You see, try as hard as they may, even tenured or not, the branches of a vine are not independent, and they never will be, because they have no source of life in themselves. If you cut them off from the vine or the tree, they will not regenerate themselves. They will simply wither and die. And so if we knowingly or not cut ourselves off from God, if we stop reading his word, if we cease praying every day, if we fail to come and worship with other people or be in a small group or a Bible study with them, we slowly but surely choke ourselves as Christians. All of these are the conduits, the vascular cambium tissue, to use the botanical term, through which the nutrients or the life-giving power of Christ, the true vine, comes to us. Because apart from Christ, we can do nothing. All we're good for is to be picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. That's why all the things that we do at this church, the most important one is simply to try to connect each of you on a regular basis with the true vine of life. That's why we have home groups and Sunday school classes and sermon discussion groups and weekly prayer programs and fellowship opportunities and any number of other chances to just try to keep you plugged in, to stay connected to Jesus. See, Bible study, as someone once said, Bible study messes with your life. But it's supposed to. It's what we needed to be doing. John Wesley understood that. What made Methodism grow at such a dizzying rate in its early years was not just the fired-up preaching of John Wesley, although it was good. It was not just the incredible dedication of the circuit riders, although that was unparalleled. It wasn't just what took place in the weekly worship services at the City Road Chapel in London or at Methodist preaching points or in the society meetings where those three simple rules, do good, do no harm, stay in love with God, keep all the ordinances of God. They were spelled out in ways that both the simple and the wise could understand. It was what happened in the class band meetings, gatherings of 10 to 12 people who met every week to study and pray together, and they asked each other such impertinently personal questions as, how fares your soul? Have you been met with any known sins this week? How are you delivered from them? Do you desire to be told of your faults? Do you earnestly desire such? These weren't, how was your day, dear, questions, or how about those Astros comments. These struck at the core of individual spiritual maturity. They called the early Methodists to a level of accountability that most people today, most Methodists today, would find uncomfortable indeed. But even if we back off some of the more personal elements of those meetings, that's where we all need to be sometimes, isn't it? If you want to grow, you have to stay connected to the vine. Oh, I know sometimes coming to church seems kind of boring, doesn't it? It does to me, every once in a while. I get up and I think, I don't want to go to church today. Julie very kindly says, you have to go, you're the pastor. And she's right. But I understand that's not always the most exciting thing a person can do. Can I tell you, it is the most significant thing we can do. Because in order to grow, we have to stay connected. In order to grow, we may also have to go through some times of pruning or being cut back. It's never easy for any of us. Notice in the metaphor Jesus gives us, it is the Father who is the gardener, who not only cuts off the branches that don't bear any fruit, but, listen to this, who cuts back the branches that do bear fruit. Why would you do that? Because you'll bear even more fruit. We had a house that we lived in for 40 years in West Houston. When my mother got older, she began to find grapefruit in her backyard, and it irritated her. She thought the people on the other side of the fence were throwing it over the fence. So she threw the grapefruit back over the fence every time she found it. Then we discovered that, unbeknownst to us, we had a grapefruit tree on our side of the fence. It hadn't done a thing for 35 years. All of a sudden, it began to put out grapefruit. And my mom, in her 80s, was tossing them back over the fence every time. They would throw them back. She'd throw them back over. I had to go apologize to them. My mom didn't realize those were our grapefruit. Sorry. Sometimes you cut things back, they produce something more. Jesus said if we remain in him, we can ask whatever we want to, and God will grant it to us. Because Jesus knows that if we really do stay joined to him, and we let his truth live in us, that the kind of things we're going to ask for are going to be the kind of things which are according to his good and pleasing will. Some time ago, I was in Sports Clips getting a haircut. I do that every month as an act of faith. And on ESPN, there was a fascinating little feature about teams that have had perfect seasons. They mentioned the Yukon women's basketball team went nearly 3 full seasons without a loss, 111 games in a row from 2014 to 2017. They mentioned the 1972 Miami Dolphins football team and the 76 Indiana Hoosiers and those classic UCLA teams of my youth in the 60s of John Wooden that won 88 consecutive games. A perfect season in any sport is pretty rare. You know what's not supposed to be rare? You and I perfecting our faith John Wesley said we are to be going on to perfection. Philippians said, St. Paul, not that I've already been made perfect, but I press on to take hold of that for which Jesus took hold of me. Forgetting what is behind, straining towards what's ahead, I press on to win the goal of the prize for which God has called me. Going on to perfection means we keep on growing. We keep on growing by staying connected to the true vine, by continuing to find our nourishment in him, by letting his words abide in us. That's how we show ourselves to be his disciples. The verb in verse 8, really, so shall you be, suggests that until the disciples of Christ bear fruit, they're not really worthy of even being called his disciples. If you are not producing fruit in your Christian life this morning, and let me make it simpler. If you don't know more about God today than you did last year, or 5 years ago, or 50 years ago, there's something wrong in your faith. You need to be deliberate about reconnecting to that true vine in your life. It's not about you. It's about God, right? Tammy Jo Schultz gets this, I think. She was the pilot who guided Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 from New York to Dallas this week when a midnight engine failure shot debris through a window of that plane. The cabin lost pressure immediately. The plane began to go into a tail dive. Married to another pilot, she's the mother of 2 teenage children. But 3 decades ago, Tammy Jo Schultz became one of the first female fighter pilots in the U.S. military, flying FA Hornets in the Navy. She's described as having nerves of steel. So despite the plane dropping 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, she was able to make an emergency landing in Philadelphia. When they landed, she walked down the aisle of the plane hugging every passenger on the plane. As reports of her heroism began to emerge, she declined all media requests for interviews. She wanted people to know it was God who was there with her on that Flight 1380. It was God who helped her get in control of that plane. Tammy Jo leads children's worship and teaches Sunday school at her church in Boerne, Texas. She said her biggest goal now is to simply share her faith and let it resonate and awaken people's eyes to how great a God we have. I am the vine. You are the branches, Jesus said. So I ask you this morning, have you been intentional about staying connected to that vine? Are you producing fruit to the Father's glory? It will never happen by osmosis or by accident. You have to be deliberate and you have to be accountable. It won't happen without the presence of other people in our lives either, who can encourage us in our faith. So are you staying close, friends? Ready to abide, let Christ reside in you. Ready to remain so he can sustain you. Ready to connect so he can reflect his presence in you. When Israel failed to produce the good fruit that God intended for them, Isaiah 5 says that the Lord asked those in Judah, what more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? I wonder, what more could God do for you and me this morning than he's already done for you and me this morning? But if we remain in him, and he in us. Did you hear this promise? Ask whatever you wish. It will be done for you. So may we ask that we bear much fruit. We show ourselves to be Christ's disciples, all to the Father's glory. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.